right, we are live. All right, guys, welcome back to another episode of Method Ministries. I'm your host, Lucas Curcio, and I am here and excited to be with Dr. Josh Howard from Eschatology Matters. So, Dr. Josh Howard, welcome to the show.
Hey, man, pleasure to be on. Great talking with you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's my second time going live too, so I'm excited to do this. Hopefully, get some more action and maybe some questions too from the audience.
Absolutely, yeah. Hopefully, it goes better than the Jared Longshore James White debate that I saw go live, and all the audio came out in the system.
Oh, really? There's some problems on there, I guess.
We've done live before, and I personally am afraid of it. We always seem to have some strange issue with it, but
yeah, me too. I always been kind of fearful of it, but I decided, you know what, let me give it some chances to see how it goes and everything. But why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience so they can know if they're tuning in for the first time?
Sure, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so my name's Josh Howard. I pastor a church here in Michigan. Co-founded a network called Eschatology Matters with a guy named Brandon Wood. So we've been rolling for, oh man, my dates are slipping now. Somewhere around in the neighborhood of 2 years, I think it is at this point, when we did our first conference, and have several contributors to our channel. So I'm just one of the guys that helps out there at this point. So I preach, I pastor, do a little bit of writing on the side. You can find some of my articles through Clear Truth Media. I've got a few books that have been published. And other than that, I'm a family man. I have a wife, 4 beautiful little kids, and they keep me busy most of the time. So that's about the gist of it.
And then you're a Tim LaHaye hyper-dispensationalist preacher.
Huge fan.
I imagine like you're like most people who usually come out of dispensationalism. Is that you?
I actually never came out of dispensationalism, so I'm one of the rare ones. So a lot of the guys we talk to at Eschatology Matters, especially if they're in the Amil Postmil camp, they'll have the horror story of coming out of dispensationalism. I watched The Thief in the Night for the first time last month with my wife, just for giggles, but just to see what all the fuss was about. But I was never dispensational. That never really fit my paradigm. I wasn't. If you'd asked me, early on, like, what are you? I'd be like, well, I'm not sure, but that doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So yeah, that was never quite my story.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, because you usually find a lot of Postmils and Amils. They like to give their testimony that, I was once a dispensationalist, and then they had like their second born again experience, and they come out and then they see the light.
Yeah. Greg Beale reached his hand down and snatched them up out of the fog. Yeah, that was never me. I remember teaching. Oh, this is early on in ministry. I was teaching. And I remember a co-pastor of ours, or at that point he was one of my pastors, but he pulled me to the side and said, "You sound like you might be Amil or something like that." And I was like, "What is that? What are mills?"
Yeah.
And then dived into the whole panoply of millennial thought.
Interesting. So I did come out of dispensationalism too. It was over I got saved in my late teens. And then I was immediately attracted and drawn to the John MacArthur eschatology. And then I think it was like in my mid-20s where I started to come out of it, and it was a pre-tribulation rapture that really did it for me.
Mm-hmm.
I still consider myself a dispensationalist for a time. That was kind of like the first chink in the armor, I guess. But what's interesting is that again, like most Amils and Postmils will give their testimony saying they came out of dispensationalism now that that led them down the path or away from premillennialism. But I'm actually just like them, but instead of leaving premillennialism, I stayed premillennial. So
you're not there yet, but there's hope. Is that what you're saying?
No, I don't think so, because I've been exploring for about maybe 2 years now, like doing some deep dives on eschatology, because like it seems like we're very passionate about this and just love the study of it. But let's go into that a little bit more. So what got you started on Eschatology Matters and just trying to talk to I guess talk about and have different conversations with people?
Yeah. So I guess because eschatology is, it's broad ranging, and I've never been one that was super obsessed with, Daniel 7-11 or charts and graphs. Like that was never, it's interesting to me. It's just never been kind of where I found real joy, honestly, from eschatology. For me, the thing about eschatology has been that whole storyline of scripture, sort of like a more broad reaching eschatology, which is kind of how we approach it on our channel, right? It's sort of the warp and woof of a story that God's writing. So really, when I started getting into eschatology, it was mainly during my MDiv studies, going through seminary. I was very intrigued by this theme of Christus Victor at the time, Christ's victory, his triumph. And I started noticing that of the guys that wrote on Christus Victor themes, that many of them were sort of outside of our theologically conservative camps, and that there wasn't a whole lot of interaction that I was finding at that point anyway. Since then, I've read more broadly, but at that point, I was not finding a whole lot of interaction with some of those themes that seemed very prominent, especially within the Gospels, as to how Christ described what he had done, and also how his earthly reign, as I'm sure we're going to get into debating, but how those things were being enacted in his work. So really, for me, the on ramp into eschatology was more of Christ as victor, Christus Victor, Christ the conquering hero of the story, so to speak. Once I jumped into that, I remember one of the big snags that hit me, and I don't remember exactly how it was. I think it was just personal study, but I hit John 12. And you're doing that sort of kind of narrative arc in John. You hit this massive point at the middle where the miracles are ramping up, the crowds are ramping down, so to speak. The opposition to Christ's ministry is beginning, even as his ministry is really becoming more and more apparent and more pronounced. And you have John 12:31, where Christ proclaims that the ruler of this world was cast down. And I remember that was stuck in my head for quite some time. So if I was to like put a little pin in the storyline somewhere, I would say that's kind of what jumped me into eschatology, thinking to myself, how is it that happened? What's entailed in that victory, and what more does Scripture have to say about that?
Okay. Now, what kind of post-millennial are you? Because, as I talk to different people, and it's, even, in the Premil camp, everybody, whether they're pre, post, or A, they have their variants. And so you
Right.
can't really always track somebody with the same exact theology. Like, if I read this book by this ex, post-millennialist or Premil, it, doesn't mean that they necessarily, subscribe to that. So what kind of post-mill are you? Are you maybe like the Ken Gentry type that, to get the conversation started?
Yeah. No, so yeah, Ken Gentry, who I've not read his new Revelation commentary yet, but he did give me was kind enough to read one of my books, gave me some feedback and a blurb on that. I appreciate Ken Gentry's work a lot. I'd say I'm a little bit tamer, I think, maybe than Ken Gentry. So
Okay.
one of the things we almost did with Eschatology Matters, we've still kicked the idea around, but we thought about sort of dividing up some of the camps within postmillennial and amillennial thought and kind of categorizing them to sort of help people navigate exactly the question you're asking. We didn't do it because I don't want to further confuse things. I don't want to draw more lines where maybe more lines would be unhelpful or unnecessary. But yeah, in general, if I'm trying to describe what sort of post-mill I am to people, I'll usually place myself as a conservative post-mill who's cautiously partially preterist. And by that I mean I don't go as far partial preterist as some have in some areas, specifically within First and Second Thessalonians, within the Revelation, those sort of areas. But in general, I think that Christ has enacted his kingdom. I think it's a present reality. I think it's a growing reality. I think it's a triumphant reality, something that will actually bear fruit. And I say that not dismissively of the other views, but
Yeah.
insofar as I think when we pray the Lord's Prayer, for example, that his kingdom will come and his will be done on earth as it is in heaven, that we can expect those things to grow and increase until that time of his return. So if you're thinking to maybe like resources or people to compare to, I love reading some of the old Princeton crowd, Warfield, the Hodges. J. Marcellus Kick is a book that I hand out liberally to all, anybody that will read it. Even if you read, I know Kuyper isn't a post millennial, but if you read Kuyper's Pro Rege, that's that whole Christ over all kind of sort of dominant vision of Christ's victory. I think that's a good place to put me in.
Gotcha. When you say conservative post-mill, you mean like you're kind of not as strong in your preterism? Was that what you meant by that?
Yeah, I don't mean conservative as
Yeah, like
opposed to
not
liberal.
politically, obviously.
I'm
Yeah,
thinking
right.
like the 80-year-old man driving through traffic.
Okay.
I'm a conservative post mill in that regard.
Gotcha. So you're not gonna like slam somebody who disagrees with you too, is what you
I'm just slow moving. That's all. I'm far older than I look, so I'm a bit slow moving.
Yeah, because I noticed there's a lot of hothead post mills out there.
Sure,
And not that you are either. And I know not everybody's the same, so you can't. So I'm not clumping everybody. I'm in
for
the same
sure.
camp, but I definitely come across a lot of hothead post mills. I had one post mill actually. I think it was like last year. And I still know who he is, but I'm not going to say it. But he told me that if I'm wrong about this millennial debate, I'm denying the nature of the Trinity.
Okay.
And I thought, man, that was an extreme statement. That this is like now, whether you say it's tertiary or secondary doctrine, now it's primary doctrine,
Well,
and I got to affirm.
to be fair, one of your brethren once told us that that if he's wrong about his historic premillennial eschatology, that we'll have to stand before Christ and tell Christ he was wrong. So I guess we've both
Oh
heard
yeah,
some things.
and then you get like the pre-tribbers who get really ruffled when you talk about that, and they're definitely quick to call you heretics too.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, eschatology is a funny business. It's obviously Doug Wilson's always saying that it's the period of peace that Christians are fond to fight about. But yeah, it's strange to me. It's an important thing, right? And nobody wants to discount that. This isn't the fact that we do eschatology with a smile on our face doesn't mean we're nonchalant or unserious about it. But at the same time, it's a story of Christ's victory. I think that should be something that maybe should lead to a little joy in the midst of the struggle.
Yeah, because I always cringe when people say, and especially pastors, that they don't really want to talk about this because they think it doesn't matter.
Right.
I always get so upset by that because there's so much in the scriptures that you're just not going to talk about if you're going to avoid eschatology. And like even like the Lord's Supper, Paul says you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Well, that's eschatological.
Right.
So it's not just okay. Let me just focus on this part of the Bible and then chop up this and kind of just forget about that because too many people argue.
Yeah, the pan millennial thing, and we've heard that. I'm sure you've heard that too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, yeah, it'll all pan out in the end. The pan millennial thing I've heard from a lot of guys, and usually it's from a joking place, and they're just saying, I'm not taking this super seriously. But a lot of times, especially with pastors, they mean intentionally what you just described is that, yes, I realize God has done something miraculous, and He's told us an awful lot about how He's bringing these things to conclusion. But rather than be wrong on any jot or tittle, I'm just going to like back off the whole culmination of this story. It's like excising the climactic ending from a movie or something. Just skipping the whole thing wraps up. If you're going to be wrong on something, be cautious, be humble in your approach, be well studied as best you can. But that's not a reason to neglect what we have been given. I don't think that would be a tragedy.
Do you think this is a tertiary or secondary doctrine?
Eschatology?
Yeah.
I think it's primary, secondary, and tertiary, depending on how you apply it.
Interesting. How's that?
Yeah, so because we talk about theological triage a lot, within the local church, and usually eschatology gets brought up as a tertiary doctrine, something that is important. It's in Scripture, but it's something not worth dividing over, even at the church level. But then you have to ask yourself, like, well, what sort of facet of eschatology? So if you're talking about a nuance of millennial theology or chiliasm or something like that, and we may have a disagreement over the exact, as I'm assuming you and I are at some point going to disagree over some timing issues. Are those things tertiary? Well, I think you can make a good case for that, right? That could be something that we shouldn't divide over. However, if you, as many of the interlocutors on our YouTube channel, if you're denying that Christ returns bodily, if you're denying that Christ raises the dead bodily, if you're denying that all flesh comes before the judgment throne of God, all of those are eschatological events. And Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says that is at the heart of the gospel. This is without that, Christ is wrong and our faith is of no hope. So those would be first order issues. So eschatology is one of those interesting things where I think most of the time people are talking about millennial convictions. They're thinking about nuances of Revelation chapter 20. Okay, I'm with you that those are probably tertiary, but with a little bit of framing, I think.
Yeah, because I thought you were going to mention actually preterism or hyper-preterism, which is true because there's a decent amount of them online right now, and they seem to be growing. And the thing that I don't like too is that a lot of Christians are giving them more leniency and tolerance. Where now if you're hyper-preterist, you can still be a Christian. You can kind of still be a part of this, and as long as you affirm the gospel, and you're still in on it. But like you mentioned too, if they deny the bodily coming and resurrection of Christ, I'm not going to say these people are Christians. And I see for some reason a lot of people are just more open to this idea that hyper-preterism can be in on the fold with us.
Yeah, it's an interesting and I'm trying to remember who first brought that up on our channel. It's hard for me to understand how prevalent it truly is. It seems very polemical online. It seems like a very vocal bunch maybe online. I'm not sure how much that's actually touching ground in the churches, but no, I agree with you on certain things. I don't think we we want to be charitable and we want to be broad. That's one of the things we've tried to model. But there's still things that you have to draw some pretty firm lines on and say, we go no further. Here's the lines of orthodoxy.
Yeah, it's true because you don't know like how much online translates to real world.
Mm,
As of yet, I haven't run across anybody in person who holds those views, but I'm sure if they're going online, then I'm sure they're going to grab some of these people, and then eventually maybe I'll come across somebody in person.
right.
And, but hopefully that just dies down and goes away. And on that note, what's interesting is what I found out too. A little while back, I was always thinking, why is there a prevalence of hyper-preterism, but I can't find hyper-dispensationalists online. If you think about it, like, is there a correlation between partial preterism leading into hyper-preterists? Because you don't see, because people will easily call dispensationalists, and I'm not a dispensationalist, but they'll call dispensationalists heresy. Well, the thing is, I haven't found a hyper-dispensationalist online, or maybe once, like maybe like 2 years ago or something. But there's a growing number of these hyper-preterists, and I'm starting to think that, wait a minute, maybe there's a correlation between the partial and the hypers over here.
So I'm curious, what would be the parameters for a hyper dispensational? Are we talking like 2-track salvation, maybe even John Hagee style, or what are we?
Like cutting, like Sermon on the Mount doesn't count for us right now. Doesn't apply for us.
Oh, you've never met those guys?
No, I think online I came across somebody like that maybe
Okay.
like a year or two ago. Not in person, definitely, but I think maybe once or twice online. Have
Yeah,
you
I
met
have.
them? Oh, really?
Yeah, yeah,
Interesting.
definitely. I've met those guys. I've met the mid-acts dispensationals, which is a little variance of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure what you're framing as hyper. If it's just the Matthew 24 doesn't apply to us, then
I
yeah, I've
well,
definitely met.
I don't think it goes so far as to chop up Paul's epistles too.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think yeah.
that's definitely out there for sure.
Yeah.
I'm sure they would. I'm sure they would radically chafe at hearing the word radical applied to them, but or hyper rather applied to them. But I think the hyper preterists would
Yeah,
reject that
definitely.
label as well.
So let's try to get let's try to get into some of the weeds over here. So I'm really curious about your view on the book of Revelation, because we talked a little bit, pre-show, and you mentioned you're kind of a progressive parallelist
Yeah.
or along those lines. So if you can explain your view, because usually the partial preterists, they interpret the book of Revelation as just, the John's version of the Olivet Discourse. So I'm curious to hear your view on that.
Yeah, this is one of the areas, you're asking like what kind of post mill I am, and this is probably the one place that most or a lot of posties would cry foul and say like this is not post mill.
Hmm.
So the thing with Revelation is there's obvious lexical and thematic ties to the Olivet Discourse. That's undeniable, right? You have things popping off in Matthew 24 and 25 that mirror things that are being described in the Revelation. And the whole interpretive problem then is this some sort of proleptic or prophetic fulfillment? Is this something here and it also happens there? Or is this in fact describing the same or similar events? The thing with the Revelation that I find challenging, or it's not the thing that every commentator on the Revelation finds challenging, is when you're looking for the dating of Revelation. That's obviously going to be key. If it's written pre-temple fall, then you have a preterist or at least partial preterist book, right? If you have it written post 70 AD, then you're going to have probably something along the lines of what I'm describing, an idealized fulfillment there, progressive parallelism, those sort of things come into play. When you get to the dating of Revelation, a lot of guys have written some really good things on that. There's internal evidence you can point to within the book of Revelation, but if you're looking externally, you have a whole testimony within the Christian church that it's written post 70 AD, and most of it comes back to one guy, to one source. That's a pretty big problem when you're dating a book. If you have essentially lots of voices echoing one solitary voice, but that's all you really have testimony of, with maybe some outliers. That makes the external evidence tough. So then you go to the internal evidence, and a lot of that, again, is just tricky. I'm going to keep just punting to the fact that it's not a slam dunk, I don't think, on the dating part. So I've always been quite sympathetic to what has been predominantly the conviction of the Christian church, which is that it was post 70 AD. So if it is post 70 AD, you're looking at idealized fulfillment. It is not solely idealized, but a more idealized fulfillment than if it was written pre 70 AD.
Okay, so interesting. Okay, so you want to say because it seems to favor the majority seems to favor a later date, that you kind of don't want to lock yourself into an early date. Is
I mean,
that it?
essentially, what I'm arguing is when you look at, so you're looking at external, internal evidence on anything like, well, especially on the Book of Revelation.
Yeah.
External evidence, I'm saying, is predominantly toward a late date for the writing of Revelation, but it's also predominantly keying upon one voice in the early church, which is a dangerous setup. Internal evidence, there's a couple of signposts that seem to point both ways. And you could look at like mentions of the temple, no mentions of the temple, things within the book of Revelation itself that you could say, this seems to indicate. But again, I'm unconvinced of those at this point. So I have cautiously favored what's been the majority opinion, which is a late date.
Okay. So, okay, yeah, because I mean that definitely does set you apart from the post mills today, because for them it's basically do or die. Really, I did read Ken Gentry though, who said that in theory, even if he was incorrect on this, Revelation could be a post-explanatory drama. Like I was just explaining what he did. I mean, I think that was kind of a kind of like a safeguard that Gentry put in there. I think he might have said that on his navigating the Book of Revelation.
The
Or
thing with that, so like what Gentry's keying in on there is, even if you take a late date for Revelation, and you take an idealized depiction of it, let me try to like break this down real simply. If you've got Revelation and it's a late date, it can still be describing what happened to the temple and showing how that reflects what God is doing in history with the church. Now, if you take an early date for the Revelation and say it was written before and primarily pointing to that temple destruction, I don't know a single commentator that would take a preterist approach to Revelation that wouldn't say it is also then pointing to what God will do within the church. So you're talking about what's the primary referent, but both sides of that debate, whether you're taking an early date or a late date, would say, yeah, it's also, though, informing the other side, whether you're looking backward or whether you're looking forward, if that makes sense. So yeah,
yeah,
I don't think you have to lose anything with the dating of the Book of Revelation, because a lot of times we're going to be reaching those same conclusions, and in my estimation, that's not going to be the deciding factor for post-mill, amill, historic pre-mill.
okay, yeah. So for you, that's definitely true. But for other ones I talked to, because I don't like it, it's not enough. I like to point this out. That Gentry's view, or those who take his view, it's not enough for them to say that it was written pre 70 AD. So they don't just need an early date; they need an early enough date, which that should translate over to AD 66, basically. Like Revelation was written no later than AD 66, because if there's this 3.5 year tribulation and John needs to warn them about that, that's going to be near and soon. He has to do that within that time frame. If so, even if, let's just say, it was written AD 68, well, that goes now into post 70 AD. That doesn't fit within their framework. And so what's interesting is that Gentry will quote a lot of people who hold to an early date, but it's not an early enough date. Like some of them will say, like, yeah, it was written pre 70 AD.
Yeah.
But you look at it, they're saying 68 AD. Gentry needs a 66 AD or earlier, or this guy's saying a 69 AD. And I think a lot of post mills don't really recognize that it's not even that it's a big stretch to say pre 70 AD, but now they need to go even further and say it's a early enough date. And I think that really puts them in a corner.
That's an interesting take on that.
Yeah. So, so would you say then that Revelation is describing events and like is like last days, like second coming, and then past 80-70?
So the way I would describe Revelation, I think, is probably going to wind up being the same as most within both the amill and post-mill camp, is that it's describing what Christ did and is doing and will do. So it's a description of what God is accomplishing throughout the church age. Like I said, we're going to place the kind of, if this is a telescope, we're going to be placing the focus of that telescope in different spots throughout history. But typically you get a little bit of idealism within most of the approaches. So one of the things we've been talking about doing is looking specifically at those four approaches, preterism, historicism, idealism, and just kind of like teasing those out. If you go to some of the more pronounced historicist approaches to the Revelation, so you think like the reformers in this camp, and you were to kind of like keyhole them into like, well, they're just looking for this to be fulfilled within their lifetime. The Pope's like the literal Pope at that time is the Antichrist, capital T, capital A. The world's about to end. We shouldn't We shouldn't expect it to go past our lifetime. Even then, they're looking for an idealized fulfillment throughout world history. So when I look to the Revelation, I'm seeing a description of God's victory over the forces of evil, but that doesn't mean it actually doesn't touch down. So what I would push back in the Revelation reading primarily would be those that read Revelation as if it doesn't actually touch down on earth. This might be a little bit of the post-mill dynamic coming in, but if it's a victory that actually spills out into this world, it's an earthly victory as well as a heavenly victory, which I believe is pretty clear, then you're going to actually have signposts in this world. In other words, it's not just something esoteric floating around in the sky. Some idealist approaches are a lot like that, and those are ones that I would be very uncomfortable with.
Okay, yeah, because I don't know a strict idealist. I know people like Dr. Beale I think even Gentry will use, kind of similar to you. There's this redemptive idealism, I want to say that he refers to.
Yeah, I don't have a huge problem with like a redemptive. I would say a redemptive covenantal approach would really be accurate for Revelation or helpful for Revelation. That's the way I would look at it. But either way, I get that.
Gotcha. Okay. Before we move on to, because I want to hear your view on Revelation 19 and 20, but Second Thessalonians. So this is how I can tell like what kind of partial preterist you are. Do you think that was Nero, or do you think that that's whether it's the Antichrist or a Antichrist, some kind of man of lawlessness figure right before Christ comes? What's your
Yeah,
view on that?
I did a deep dive on this. We were preaching through First and Second Thessalonians, and you hit First Thessalonians 4. Most everybody's in agreement. Okay, we're looking second coming here, final coming of Christ, which is in and of itself kind of a little shibboleth, whether you say second or final. But then you get to First Thessalonians 5 and Second Thessalonians 2, and those two tend to kind of dovetail together. Where you go in First Thessalonians 5, a lot of times is going to dovetail with how you approach Second Thessalonians 2. I still see both of those in the future. So if you're looking for post-mill authors that would take that approach, there's several. I think even Greg Bonson took that approach, if I'm remembering
Oh,
correctly.
really?
Doug Wilson takes that approach. There's several guys that would be comfortable within the post-mill camp that would see it that way. So I think Nero was a little man of lawlessness. I think he's pointing to a greater man of lawlessness there in that passage, though.
Okay, interesting. So, so you still posit a final, I don't know if you would call him an antichrist, but whatever beast, man of lawlessness, right before Christ comes.
Yeah, yeah.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess that's the thing that I also like to highlight too, because the post-mill and pre-mill will get into this war of optimism, and the pre-mills are pessimistic because they believe certain things about the future. And what I like to push back is say, well, wait a minute, hold on. Most post mills I talk to, especially on mills, they believe that there is going to be a final antichrist, and even if it's not the great tribulation, it's a tribulation. So something's happening right before the end time. So like, how would you, if that's the case, then, because I don't know how far deep you get into the issue of optimism in these discussions, but usually that's a defining feature for post mills, and they really want to make sure that this is kind of almost the standard by which we judge eschatology by. But again, like what I would like to point out too is that, well, wait a minute, if we both believe in a final figure coming before Christ does, then wouldn't we then both be, in their terms, pessimists? So I don't know how you would respond to that.
Yeah. So okay. Yeah. Let's just jump into the optimism thing. So
Yeah.
we'll throw out a caveat and just recognize nobody wants to be referred to as pessimistic. Okay, like there's no Christian that wants to say like, yeah, I've got to roll. I don't think there is. Maybe they're out there, but most guys would chafe against being labeled as a pessimistic Christian. At the same time, when we say optimism, we're not just saying that Christ triumphs in the very last day, like the end of history has Christ on the throne. Orthodox Christianity agrees on that. So when we're using that moniker optimism, we're really angling at what the church's experience is in this world. In other words, what that leads up to Christ's final victory, what that looks like. Is that optimistic? So that's the caveat at the front end. Okay, so when I say optimism, I'm really referring to not does Christ win? We're all Christians, we agree. But what is the kind of course? Is it going to be pessimistic until he wins, or is it going to look more optimistic? The thing that I don't think dissuades that, and this is one of the kind of misnomers or misapplications that people will give it to post-mill, is that there's not opposition to Christ in the end. So what I believe Scripture teaches is that the nations will in fact bow their knees to Christ. He will do that in his own good time, and we pray that it'll be soon, but it may be a little later. But that every last nation will bow its knee to Christ. What we're not saying is that every last individual within every last nation will bow their knee. There will be those in rebellion. I have yet to find a postmillennial author, even some of the Puritans with some of their very, very strongly optimistic language. I have yet to find anybody that says there won't be a final person standing in rebellion there on the final day when Christ does return in the flesh. So that's there. When I read the Revelation, I'm taking that to say that Satan will have a final time when he rises. Revelation 20 describing him gathering and deceiving the nations. Now, I don't think that means he's deceiving the nations in total, because the nations will bow their knees to Christ, but he'll deceive some from those nations. There will be a deception at work in which there will be a large horde gathered against Christ. I don't take that to mean a dominant horde, and we could get into all the lexical details there, but the whole discussion is, what is our expectation for this world leading up to Christ? Or are we expecting more and more people to come to Christ, more and more nations to bow, until finally every last nation has bowed? And we can actually look at world history and say that Christ has reigned, because we're told in 1 Corinthians that he is reigning and will reign, continue to reign until every last enemy has been destroyed, the last enemy being death. Can we expect that to actually play out in world history? Now, the non-postmillennial hears that and they think, that's just utopia. That's not what's being described. What's being described is a Christianized world, a gospelized world. Does Christ conquer the world and return to conquer those who are in final rebellion, those last vestiges of rebellion against him? Or is he coming back to a persecuted few, a victorious and yet very small and battered Christian minority, which he then rescues and crushes the rest of the world? That's where the whole optimism thing comes in.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll let you respond though.
Would so you don't like the word utopianism, right? So I imagine the golden age too is not a word you would use as well. You would want to use Christianization. Is that like
Yeah,
a more accurate word?
the golden age thing to me is interesting, because it really depends on who you read. So if you look back to some of the, especially the Puritan postmillennial writers, they
Yeah.
had an expectation that the millennium, or at least many of them did, that the millennium would start at some point in the future. That's not what most postmillennials today would
Yes,
confess,
correct. They
including
were
myself.
historicists. Yeah.
Right, yeah. So they're looking for something to kind of start in the future, and they're also describing it as a golden age, where it does start to sound a bit like a utopian world. I don't think that's accurate, but I would say that if what I just said is in fact biblical, or is in fact what God has deigned to do in history, let's say 10,000 years from now, the gospel keeps on spreading. Christ's kingdom is being victorious on earth as it is in heaven. And we're seeing nations bow the knee to Christ here and there, rebellions, backsliding, all the things that go with sin. And yet, on the whole, we see a Christianization of the world. Could we expect a more utopian world? Yeah, I think where the kingdom is, there's peace. There's the grace of God at work. There's Christians doing Christian things. You should expect that to look a good bit different. I think when we say utopia, though, the expectation is there's an absence of sin, an absence of death, an absence of all those things. That's not what I would be comfortable with utopian language.
Okay. I'm glad you know the history of postmillennialism, because a lot of people, they don't know that. And even historicism too, which is really interesting eschatology. It's lost. Like, we don't really know what that was, and we don't realize how it was just that's equivalent back then to like the 17th, 18th century. Dispensationalism now is dominant. Well, historicism was the dominant eschatology, and nobody really knows what that teaches. But it's interesting though, is because when people usually go to the post-mills of the 17th, 18th century, what I also like to point out is that, but they agree with me. The millennial wasn't now. As you said, the millennial was a future dispensation. And nobody knows that. People think that postmillennialism is just like a modified version of amillennialism. But what I like to call it nowadays, and I don't mean any disrespect by this, I might call it neo-postmillennialism. And what I mean to say is it's a modified version of postmillennialism. Because if you look at the post-mills in the past, they were historicists. They believed Israel's conversion, that would inaugurate the millennial. Once they're converted, that would overflow into the world. And nowadays, it went from historicism to preterism. Some, not all, are Christian Reconstructionists. Not all of them are, but they'll take some like principles. What do they call it? General equity theonomists. They call it. I think stealing that from the Westminster Confession of Faith.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, So I'll push back on that just a little bit,
Yeah.
because I would think so. So postmillennialism is a new term, right? This is for most of Christian history, it would have been referred to as amillennialism, and then you start to have a radical distinction, and really a lot of it became pronounced with the as I mentioned, the old Princeton Guard. You start to see kind of a differentiating of postmillennial thought. So you're talking they're 150 years old. So if you push back past that 150 years, you get to now, and you have a Gerhardus Voss, or you put a Marcellus Kick down. You could say, okay, I can see which camp this guy clearly falls into. It becomes a little bit dicier the further back you push. One of the early fathers that I think is an interesting case study would be Augustine. For those who study Augustine, many would just kind of dismissively say, well, he's amillennial, or just kind of assume an amillennial thought process. But if you read Augustine, there's a lot of postmillennial sounding language in there. Those just weren't categories Augustine was playing with. Those are pretty new within Christian history. So I would say we can risk, and I don't mean this about what you just said, but like
Yeah,
we can risk a little bit of anachronism if we try to rigidly enforce some of those categories, looking back to guys that may have been a little bit more in the middle, even as we've been describing tonight. My interpretation of a certain book may be a little bit different than Ken Gentry's, and
yeah.
how to find a camp to put them in, that sort of thing.
What would you say is the big verse for you that teaches postmillennialism? Like I don't know if there was one verse that that was the nail in the coffin that got you out of. I think you were a premill before. You said
Mm-mm.
you were on mill.
Yeah, I was I
On
was
mill.
I
Gotcha.
was an optimistic Amil-ish.
Okay, was it John 12? That was the one that really did it for you.
John 12 was interesting within seminary, but as far as postmillennial thought, because really if you're within the Amil postmill world, you and I have timing issues, right?
Yeah.
Like when it comes to our eschatology, I think we're going to agree probably a lot on the tone and tenor of what that millennium looks like. We're just going to be disagreeing on some of the timing indications. If you're within the Amil postmill world, you're really talking about to what extent that millennial reign touches down. So within Amil postmill camps, you're both agreeing, okay, the millennium's here. It started with Christ's coming. It's going to be culminated and consummated when he returns. But to what extent does it touch down? Is it primarily a spiritual reality that sort of has some earthly blessings, but really it's aimed at the spiritual realm, which would be most amillennial thought? Or is it something that touches down in this world, which would be more postmillennial? For me, most of the things that I've written on have been within the gospel narratives, because what I find compelling is how Christ specifically described not only the manner and tenor of his reign, but also how that reign is expressed in this world. So if you're looking for the key passages that sort of push me toward a postmillennial worldview, probably the most important, I think, would be the strongman narrative. I just wrote an article about this, by the way, for Clear Truth, so that should be out there. But it's in the Synoptic Gospels. It's in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's also called the Beelzebul controversy, but it's describing Christ having come, restrained the strong man who occupied the house being the world. And he says that he restrained that strong man in order that he could plunder the house of its goods. In other words, he was here to take what was the previous owners, which was the strong man. It's a very earthy illustration. It's something that actually touches down here. It's also something that bears fruit. In this world, Christ didn't come to restrain the strong man and then whisk people away. He says he actually came to lay hold of his goods. What was his, Christ came to set right. That would probably be right up at the top of my list. But I would say a second one is just the kingdom parables in Matthew chapter 13. You've got the parables that most of us are familiar with, right? But just something as simple as that one little verse of the flour and the leaven, that the leaven is put in the flour. And Christ says, this is what the kingdom is like. If you're wondering, disciples, this is what the kingdom looks like. It's like some leaven. You put it in the dough, the flour that he talks about, and it spreads. And anybody that's done, a little bit of bread work around the house understands what that looks like. It's not something that stops on the top. That would be a problem. It's something that actually permeates the loaf. It may take a while. I think in the case of the kingdom growth, I think it is taking a while, but it's something that actually permeates and changes the loaf. All of those things, just to kind of try to wrap up my answer to your question, but all of those things point to something that actually changes the world here. That would be the postmillennial vision. is that yes, Christ's kingdom is not of this world, insofar as it does not generate from this world. It is not something that man erects by blood and sweat, and yet it's something that touches down in this world because Christ took on flesh. And he rose bodily from that grave and reigns as the risen God man in the flesh. It's actually something that gets expressed here in this world.
Okay, interesting. I want to ask you about Revelation 20 because this is actually something on my mind, and I'm actually really curious to because the Amil has the same problem, but at least in my mind it does.
There's no problems with Postmil. Just come
Yeah,
over to
no,
the topic.
absolutely, it's a
There's
perfect
no problem
system.
passages.
Jeff Durbin will tell us so. Do you take going back to a future final Antichrist figure-ish, whatever you call him, Antichrist or man of lawlessness? I don't know what kind of language. I know some people get very particular with that. I don't know why, but they do. But so Satan's release that happens post-millennial. Do you believe, like Dr. Beale and most progressive parallelists, that short time that Satan's released for, that is when Revelation 13 happens and when that small period of falling away or deception happens?
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
So for those who aren't aware, for I guess the 5 people that will watch this that haven't read Greg Beale, yeah. So you're referring to like the interpretation of Revelation where you have sort of a sequencing of the chapters that progress in parallel with one another through the book. Like 7 sets of chapters that essentially are telling the same story just from different angles, that sort of thing. So when you get to Revelation chapter 20, number one, you have a man of lawlessness that Paul refers to in 2 Thessalonians 2. You have the Antichrist, which John refers to in his letters. And to make things, all the more confusing, when John refers to the Antichrist, obviously we're familiar with the fact that there are Antichrists and there's also a spirit of Antichrist. So you have a lot going on there, which is one of the reasons why I would hesitate to be overly dogmatic, but I see a strong tie between a man of lawlessness and an Antichrist figure. I see no problem with that. That's a pretty widely held Christian interpretation of that passage. So then if you're to look to Revelation 20, and you're to see this final time of rebellion, number one, the final time of rebellion seems something consummative. So you have Satan, in my view, being restrained presently, and then you get a lot of the nature of his restraint by seeing what happens when he is not restrained. So when Satan is unbound, this quick but final time of rebellion, Revelation 20 says that he immediately goes to the work of deceiving others. So he deceives those from the nations, leads them in revolt or rebellion, and is quickly squashed. I always say it's kind of an anticlimactic passage because it's violent, but it's so quick, right? Satan's revolt is brought to nothing quite quickly. So yeah, I would see those things tied. For those that would take a more preterist approach, I understand why you would be seeing the man of lawlessness tied to Nero or one of those first century characters. I get that, but I think there's a lot to commend tying that to what John's referring to.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Yeah, because the question that I've been thinking about lately, because I've been dealing with the recapitulation a lot more. With my debate with Keith Foskey, I was dealing with that topic a lot. I'm really studying it, and the issue I have with the Amel view is that if they want to interpret the Revelation 13 as that short time when Satan's release, if Revelation 20 verses 1 through 6 is before that, my question is, why does John in verse 4 specifically mention the souls who died during that great tribulation as coming to life if that hasn't happened until post-millennial? Like, does that make sense?
You have lost me. I was not prepared to do a deep dive on Revelation. Where are you at in chapter 13, brother?
Well, chapter 13, we have the beast. He persecutes the church. People lose their heads literally for not taking the mark. And so we go to Revelation 20, the Amil. It sounds like you agree. It recapitulates from the first coming of Christ. And then post-millennial, Satan's released for a short time. And the Amil interprets that short time as when the events of Revelation 13 happen. And so my question is, there seems to be a timing problem then still in that view, because why does John mention in verse 4 the souls slain during that period of tribulation if that doesn't happen until post-tribulation? Does that make sense?
You're in 20 now, right?
Yeah, 20.
Yeah, the thrones seated on them were those to whom the authority. I'm not following you. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Basically, I'm saying is if the tribulation happens post-millennial, why does John then mention in verse 4 the saints dying during that tribulation? Does that make sense?
It does. I'm not following why that would be a potential problem.
Basically because in the Amil view, that tribulation shouldn't be happening yet. It happens post-millennial, not during the millennial. So John seems to be saying that the saints who died during the tribulation are coming to life and then reigning with Christ. So there seems to be a timing chronological problem.
I might need to get back to you on this
That's
one.
okay. Yeah, that's okay.
Trying to
It's just a
follow you,
question.
but yeah.
Yeah, I had lately.
Yeah. No, I
It's a
could
problem.
definitely get back to you, and yeah, I'd love to talk through that one.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely not a problem. Well, let me ask you. You can ask me some questions too if you want to challenge me or ask me anything as a post-mill or pre-mill.
Yeah. No.
Be fair.
So Premil. I'm glad to talk to a historic Premil. We can't find you guys very frequently these days, so
What did
I'm
you have
glad.
Scott Ananoli on?
Oh, Scott Aniel.
Annual.
We did have Scott. We've had Scott Aniel on. It was to we didn't chat. We didn't chat eschatology proper. We were
Okay.
discussing tangential issues, but yeah, no. I mean, with the historic pre-mill, because you like I said, you've got a lot of the similar features, right? You have the nature of the kingdom is very heavenly but earthly, right? You have a lot. You're connecting a lot of the same dots. Um, I guess a lot of it does get down to the chronology of it. One of the questions that I think is kind of perennially raised to historic pre-mills is what is going on during that millennial reign. What is going on with how are people being saved? Are they being saved? Is there still like what would be your before I ask any like detailed questions, like what would be your envisionment of that millennial reign insofar as like what sort of people are inhabiting it? Who's running around during
Yeah,
that
I
time?
gotcha. I've been leaning more towards lately. It will only be the Christians with resurrected bodies. I think it fits the exegesis well of Revelation 20, where those coming to life and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. Well, who are those? Those are those who keep the testimony of Christ. And in contrast to those are the dead. So those two people groups, one's coming to life, and then John says in verse 5, the rest of the dead did not come to life. So one's coming to life, one is not coming to life. So who's coming to life? It's believers. And so it seems to fit the exegesis well of, well, okay, those are only saints. Those are those who enter the millennial kingdom. However, you have passages like Isaiah 65, where the child will live to 100, and if he dies, he'll be thought accursed. Then, in particular, and even stronger, I would say, too, is Zechariah, where Christ clearly comes, his feet touch down Mount Olives, he reigns, and then he punishes those during that time period of his reign who won't come up to worship him. And the punishment includes like it won't rain upon them. So the issue that I'm seeing is, well, okay, well, how do I reconcile these two? What's going on? As of now, I just want to be careful. I don't want to pin myself too much. I want to say probably right now, I would say only resurrected saints. However, I'm still open to the idea that I could be wrong, and it would be unresurrected body saints and people also inhabiting that time period.
Okay. No, that's helpful because
And John Gill takes that view, by the way.
yeah, John Gill. What was it I picked up about John Gill the other day? He's got some interesting things to his eschatology. I'm starting to realize.
Well, did you hear his view on who the and again, I think this fits with the exegesis too. The objection is, okay, well, who are those people that Satan deceives them post millennial? If Christ has reigned for 1,000 years, John Gill says it's the dead, and the reason why is the Satan's released after 1,000 years, and then simultaneously that's when the dead are raised. And then it says in verse 9, it says they went up on the breadth of the earth. One theologian, Webb Mealy, I don't know if you heard of him. He has some wacky views, so I don't want to promote him too heavily. But he highlights how went up shows that they're coming from the underworld, and so the dead are simultaneously resurrected. There's a a mass army coming to try to wipe out the saints and defeat Christ. It doesn't happen, obviously.
yeah,
But that's because the dead are resurrected. Why Satan's released, and so Satan then basically just says one more time, just deceives them one more time. Let's try to get them, and then they just fail in that. And so I think even if again I'm wrong on only resurrected saints, I think the exegesis is there that who Satan is deceiving encompasses the dead. They're definitely a part of the army.
okay. And I ask this not to try to pin you on it. I'm
Yeah, it's okay.
genuinely curious because one of the big issues I think that I have with historic premillennialism, there's a lot of similarities. It's what's happening there in that millennium, because I think so. Like with you, no childbirth, no death during the millennium, then.
I could be wrong on that.
But like you're kind of like maybe
Yeah, I'm
not.
kinda like, I'm 50-50 now.
Okay.
Like, I'm still not decided. Like, I don't wanna be too dogmatic with either one.
That's the part I feel like gets a little dicey for me. I'm curious like how those dynamics play out. You've got, 1 Corinthians 15 says that Christ raises the dead at his coming, those
Yeah,
who
yeah,
are in
yeah.
Christ. So then you start to wonder, like, well, what happens with those being saved during the millennium? Are there any saved during the millennium? What do those
I
resurrections look like?
Yeah, so this is more of a recent view for me, so I could still, answer those questions because I still think either one could work.
Okay.
And one of the things that I would like to highlight, because you mentioned First Corinthians, where I'm trying to look for the verse here. I think it's in, what is it, verse 23, First Corinthians. Paul says, speaking of Christ, but each one of it in his own order, Christ the first fruits, afterward those who are Christ at his coming. And so so there's a first resurrection there. So I think Paul, it does deal with the fact that Christians get resurrected before the dead. Even if you want to say the dead are resurrected immediately after that, there's still an order here. Like think of First Thessalonians, when Christ comes back, who's going to meet Christ in the air? Well, first is going to be the dead Christians at that time, and then all the Christians who are alive.
Sure.
So
I
Paul,
think I think the problem is if you've got those two, like order wise, yes. If you've got 1,000-year gap in there, you start to have, I would think, like some Second Peter 3 problems. Like I don't know that those things would necessarily match up, or that would be my pushback, right?
Gotcha. Yeah, so I would direct you to a really good book that I just read like 2 weeks back by Matt Waymeyer, and
Read
he
it.
answers the two. What's that?
I've read it. Yeah, I
Oh,
think I think
okay.
we were supposed to have Matt Waymeyer come on at one point,
Oh, really?
but
You gotta
yeah,
give me his email because I tried finding his email and I couldn't get him on either.
it's always the
He was out.
challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. But, he says so, like, if you zoom out, this is what God is gonna do, and if you zoom in, you see there's a structure to it, and I think even with Paul places the resurrection of the saints first. So Christ is resurrected. Even First Corinthians, he doesn't mention the resurrection of the dead, only the saints. Christ comes, it's them first. So that means there's a first in hierarchical terms of who's getting resurrected first, and it's clearly the saints. And so that would fit in with, well, there's this intermediate stage because the end comes. I like to point out in First Corinthians, not when Christ comes, but in verse 24, he says, "Then comes the end." Well, when, Paul? When he delivers the kingdom to God the Father. So that's not when Christ comes. Paul is saying Christ comes, then, as in sequence, the end comes when he does this, which is give the kingdom to God the Father. So there's this intermediate stage. That's why I said if you zoom out, this is what
Unless
Christ is going to do.
Postmil's right, and he actually hands that kingdom in its completion over to the Father upon his return.
Yeah, exactly. Like you could say, yeah, like as a post mill and even on mill, you could say, well, there is a sequence there, but it's an immediate sequence, is what you could
Right.
say. Yeah, exactly.
And
So
I think that would fit with, he keeps going down through 53, 54, and 55, that whole area where he says that death is swallowed up. And that's why, like, when I'm considering, you said you're 50-50 or whatever, but it's an interesting view because death being swallowed up in victory at Christ's return, but then death persisting within this perfect millennial reign, which he then brings to consummation. That one's always been a trouble spot for me with those historic premills that would say death continues in some form or fashion. Does that make
is it
sense?
gotcha? Yeah, definitely. Is it kind of basically, essentially just the same on mill objection? It's the two age model, basically, right? Like the Bible says, when Christ comes, this is what he does. He resurrects the saints and then recreates the new heavens and new earth. Is that I guess,
You
like the
could
big objection?
Yeah, you could have the two age model. I'm sympathetic to the two age model. The thing is, when Christ returns, it's the nature and manner of his return. What is he returning to do? Paul's argument in 1 Corinthians 15. Again, I know you're saying like it could be something that's in order. It seems climactically tied together that when he returns to give the kingdom to the Father and to swallow up death and victory, and that the last enemy to be destroyed. That seems like consummative language in 1 Corinthians 15 specifically. That's why a lot of amillennial and postmillennial guys, this would be the slam dunk chapter we would go to, right? Like 1 Corinthians
Yeah.
15 sounds quite climactic upon Christ's return.
I would actually say it doesn't. And I do hear what you're saying. Like those are true statements. Like Christ will actually do this when he comes. I just think there's an order to it, kind of like his first coming, or not even kind of, almost exactly like it, where the New Testament, it's hard to find a distinction between his first and second coming. I don't know if you read Justin Martyr, but he argued that you can kind of see it with the suffering passages and then the reigning passages. I think it's still hard to see it. Um, so I think the same thing could be said. It's a true statement. Christ is going to do this, but then there is still this structure to how he does this. And I think, even with the word like then, like Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:7, he says after that, or some translations will say then. After that, speaking of Christ appearing to 500 brethren, he says after that he was seen by James, then by all the apostles. So then there is denoting sequence, and that's what he does in verses 23 and 24. He goes, Christ coming, and then verse 24, then comes the end. So there would be this sequence. And even if you want to say it's immediate, it's an hour, it's a day, like whatever it is, there's something going on here between events.
Mm.
And so I think you could harmonize it, because like I do understand and respect you guys. Like I know you're looking to, like we are, like, harmonize the Bible together is what we're trying to do. We're trying to make sense of it all. Where the Postmil.
Let me ask you a clarifying question then, and I'm not trying to jump out of
Yeah, it's okay.
Corinthians on you, but it just dawned on me that one of the main things that I'll usually try to establish is like, what is the nature of Satan's defeat, or is there a defeat of Satan right now? Like, how would you see that? Because I brought that up earlier. Usually that's kind of a huge mile marker with eschatology. How would you see Satan's current state?
Yeah, that's a great question, because a lot of people, I wish on-mills and post-mills were aware of this. So George Eldon Ladd did a really good job talking about this. So there was a binding of Satan in Matthew 12, or that binding, happened at the cross. However, that's a redemptive one, not a political one. And so, like, Hebrews 2 says that Christ defeated Satan. So that was actually a real victory that happened at the cross. So Satan is defeated now, but the binding in Revelation 20 is not the same one. It's a political one. So one was redemptive and then one was political. So, those problem passages that people like to point out, like, oh, this is the same binding going on. We'd like to say, well, that's two different contexts. And just because, they even use the same word binding, like Matthew 12 does, it doesn't mean the context is using that in the same way this one is. So does that make sense? Like, even if you disagree.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would definitely disagree. I get what you're saying. And obviously, yeah, if you've got Deo in both passages, that doesn't necessarily, to me, because the political part's interesting. But like, let's just stick with like just redemptive. If you have Christ bind Satan redemptively, let's just say, so you've got Matthew 12. He binds the strong man. He says he's going to plunder his house, which I think most commentators would take to be the world. That's certainly how I would take it. What is he plundering the world of? And is that not a marking of his kingdom? Since he kind of prefaces the whole situation by saying, if you see he casts out a demon. He says, hey, if you see me exorcising demons, you know the kingdom of God is at hand. And then let me tell you about this greater exorcism that is to come. I'm going to ekbalo, bind and cast out the ruler of this world himself, Satan. Like, how would you take that?
Yeah, so I would just make a distinction between, exactly that again. There's a redemptive one and a political one, and you can understand this probably, maybe with more common phrase, already not yet. So Christ actually did bind Satan, and then, like Paul says in Colossians 1, he translated us from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of his son. And so that actually happens and did happen. Like, Christ really does do this. But the one in Revelation 20 is the political one, which is defined as Satan's not deceiving the nations.
When you say political, could you help me with that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So the purpose clause in Revelation 20 is so that he won't deceive the nations anymore. And so if you look at what happens before he's bound, he does just that, and all the nations persecute Christians. So during that millennial kingdom, he's in the abyss, he's locked away. That's not happening. Then what happens afterwards? He once more deceives the nations, and the nations do the exact same thing. They attempt to at least persecute, the Christians. And so Satan is bound over here politically. The saints are reigning with Christ, or even now beforehand, they're resurrected with Christ, and they are spiritually reigning with Christ. And that's due to the political binding. I'm sorry, the redemptive binding. But as we live, there's also persecution going on. Like Christians, even in China, they're literally getting their head chopped off in various, well, no, China, but in various places. There's underground churches, And so
Sure.
the reason why is because there's two different bindings.
So are you talking about, so is another way of saying political and redemptive, would that be more like spiritual and earthly? Or am I missing you on that? Because
Well,
in my
not
in my mind, if you have a nation, like for example,
yeah.
if you have a nation full of Christians, and I'm not trying to go the whole theonomy Christian nationalism thing on here, we don't have time tonight, but if you have a nation full of Christians, is it redemptive? Yeah. Is it going to be political? I would think so. I don't. I'm trying to understand the line you're drawing, especially if Christ said to pray for His kingdom to come on earth as in heaven. That seems both redemptive and earthly, unless you're defining political as something different.
No, like I would define like political, like Satan does really work in the sons of disobedience, like Paul says. So like and he's a ruler or the prince of the power of the air. He's a god of this world or age. So there's this real power that Satan has, not over our souls, because Christ, beat him at the cross. So Satan has no power over my soul right now. But politically, he has power in this world, and that's why we still have sin and suffering and persecution.
I guess the reason I'm struggling with the political thing is like it's not like Satan's. It's not like he's floating policy platform positions or running for office, right? Like Satan's working through people.
Well, Kamala Harris is running for office.
Gracious. All right. Yeah, fair. So no, but like just thinking to like, I mean, honestly, like if Satan is politically active, saying that the redemptive aspect of Christ's kingdom does not impact the political machinations of this world, that sounds to me like a two-story type of a thing where it's spiritual up here and earthly down here, which I'm familiar with that debate. The political thing seems to be made up of people who can be redeemed, which seems to tie them together, does it not?
Well, you can still. I think all camps deal with that, though. Especially, all camps seem to affirm already not yet, where there's something that did happen spiritually, yet there's still an not yet factor to it, which is why we live in a fallen world still, and still have suffering and persecution. Like even under your view, you still have that factor. Like you don't believe in again, like you're not a hyper-preterist. So even under your view, there's this unfulfilled aspect of the kingdom that hasn't happened yet, even more so than the amillennial, because the millennial reign is fully consummated, basically. With the post-mill, there's still this unfulfilled aspect where in the dispensation, or sorry, in a future dispensation, or say like 100 years from now, 1,000 years from now, it's going to be at a further state of growth than it is now.
Well,
So,
I would say too, though. I mean, amillennials, to be fair, would also say that it's inaugurated and not yet consummated. So that's one of Greg Beale's big things as well, right? That the kingdom is not yet quite consummated until Christ returns. But they would be pointing to a spiritual reality, which is why I'm pushing in on the political dynamic there. Is that if Christ is redeeming people, and I read Matthew 28:18 to be, or 28:18 through 20 to be saying He's redeeming nations and has called us to disciple the nations. If that's the case, then there's no bifurcation between political and redemptive. If people are being saved and Christ's kingdom is expanding and His will is being done on earth as in heaven, I would think that would encapsulate all of the things within that sphere, that the kingdom growth would not be hampered by political machinations. We could still say, yes, there's evil states. Yes, there's a beast dynamic with the evil rulers of this world. Nobody's going to argue with that. You can see those things within evil regimes like in North Korea. No argument there, right? But defining kingdom work, though, I'm questioning how we can define political from redemptive, especially if Christ says He came to set the house in order.
gotcha. What would you say to Ephesians 2, where Paul says He's a prince of the power of the air? Is that not political?
Well, again, I think genuinely, I think I'm missing what you're saying with political, because Satan being the prince of the power of the air, describing that he is at work in the spiritual realm. So Paul obviously has this kind of preacher motif he's working with, right? So he's saying like he's a spiritual power that's touching down. If anything, Paul's calling Satan the prince of the power of the air, is connecting the fact that Satan is not just some heavenly or in hell enemy, that he's actually an enemy that works here, and yet it has an impact with the things of this world. That would be Paul's referent point there. So I would say that does impact both politics and redemptive, unless I'm missing.
Like do you think that politics in terms of power, right? Like, do you think that Satan has some kind of power still?
Yes, power, but a power that's been
authority.
The authority thing I would push back on. I think his authority was stripped when Christ, as the risen God-man, said that all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to Him. That, in my mind, leaves no authority left for Satan to grab hold of. However, is Satan still an influence and an active opponent of Christians? Yes, but he's one that's been restrained to the point where Christ said that he has bound him up, using that same language of binding a donkey, or of Herod having bound a prisoner and drug him into court. Same verbiage that's used in the New Testament. Christ said he has forcibly wrenched him to a chair that he might plunder his goods. So, I mean, I would reject the authority part, but I would say yes to the influence part for sure.
Yeah, like, just some kind of like, power, and everything. By the way, do you got to get going because it is
I
an hour?
do. I just
Yeah.
noticed the clock.
Yeah, same. Let's do this
Sorry,
again. That was
brother.
really awesome. Good
No,
morning to you.
absolutely. And I will look back through the notes, because I know I was missing you earlier on Revelation. I don't want to do you an injustice.
Oh,
So
that's okay.
let me check with that, and maybe
Yeah,
we
that
can
was
get
just a recent
back on it.
question, and, like, I'm generally asking that, like, not trying to put you in a corner,
No,
because I
for
just
sure.
wanted
Yeah,
to hear how on-mills and post-mills would, respond to that and everything.
absolutely.
But I'll let you go, and thanks so much for coming on. It's a lot of fun. Let's do this again.
Same here, brother. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, my pleasure. And to the viewers, you can please like this video and subscribe, and thanks again, and we'll see you next time. God bless. Let's end the stream.